just being published now with Patricia Aberdeen, and the book is called Megatrends 2010. What's the rest of it? The Rise of Conscious Capitalism. So we're going to talk to Patricia about that, and if you've heard of the Megatrends books over the previous 2 decades or so, then we're going to continue with more. So let's meet Patricia.
Hi, Jean.
How are you?
I'm just great.
Good.
I'm just fantastic. And I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about this book, and it hasn't even come out yet, so we can't even show
I know.
a copy.
I know. It won't actually be published until September. It will be in your bookstores in September. So naturally, when I wanted to introduce Megatrends 2010 to the whole world, I wanted to work with an established, wonderful, widely admired journalist. And that's why I turned to you to say, let's do the very, very first interview about Megatrends 2010 in Somerville, like 2 miles from my home in Cambridge.
In Cambridge.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you know, it's about local, and part of your book is about sort of taking advantage of the small local resources that are around you instead of just relying only on the big guy.
Well, before we even get into it, I'm going to say how true that is, because one of my favorite stories out of the whole book is about my new relationship with Wainwright Bank. And I talk about that in the chapter on socially responsible investing. There's a whole section on what's called community investing. And that's about having your bank account with a bank that's very active in communities and that loans to really good causes. And I had decided that I had it with my bank. We won't say what my old bank was, but
But it merged 3 times?
yeah, or maybe 5 in the past few years. And I was thinking, I was reading about these socially responsible banks, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if I could find one? And I have walked by Wainwright Bank so many times, and I never knew that they were, arguably the most important community bank, with 1 or 2 other great ones. There's a great one in Chicago, Shore Bank. And I had no idea that was what I was dealing with. And so as I did the research for my chapter on socially responsible investing, I was like, I need a new bank. Wainwright Bank is a community bank. This is so fantastic. And I learned about the bank, and I found out that they're like the 12th largest bank in the Boston area. And
Wow.
yeah, and yet, and that's not big. I mean, that compared to other banks,
Yeah.
but they're responsible for half of the housing that's been built for AIDS people. And so, I mean, they really do so much more in terms of community investing. And the amazing part is that their default rate on the loans that they make to these worthwhile causes
Right.
is about 0%.
Wow.
And it is just a great local resource, and they have at least 1 branch in Somerville.
Yeah, they do. I think they have 2, but yeah.
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 And so this was a great example of learning about what's going on locally through doing like global research on these mega trends. So it's sort of like mega trends, but what's going on locally.
Yeah. So talk to us about, I mean, even to find that bank and to find out, because I think people worry on the flip side of that. They worry that, they've got some little local bank that doesn't have enough money, that's not going to exist long enough
Right.
to bother to invest in it,
Exactly.
to put your money in it, and you sort of have the Black Thursday thing creeping around in your brain a little bit when you look at the little bank. So
Right.
how do you find that out? How do you distinguish between, a really big bank or a tiny bank that's doing well, that's doing the work how do you find that out?
Well, one of the principles I should tell you that the subtitle of Megatrends 2010 is The Rise of Conscious Capitalism. And I begin my book, I have this story in the preface about how I am a capitalist. I want my money to earn money. And I'm also a spiritual seeker. And one of the most important themes in the book is about spirituality in business. So anyway, there are a lot of wonderful people who go about looking for worthwhile causes without any particular regard to of the financial strength behind it. I don't happen to be one of those people. I am interested in organizations, if I'm investing, that make money, but I also want them to be good citizens. And just sort of going back to our local example, Wainwright Bank is one of the top 20 most sustainable businesses in the world.
Wow.
And there's this little list that's put together by an outfit called Progressive Investor, called the Sustainable Business 20. And they list the 20 most sustainable businesses. This is not just banks, this is businesses. And a good chunk of them are not US companies. So it was like so thrilling for me to find out that Wainwright was listed in the 2004 list. And they make money. They are a regular bank. They're not a foundation that just does good things. So they are enormously viable financially. Their earnings per share grow rapidly over the years. They're highly profitable. And so that's one of my criteria. What is conscious capitalism? It's about being a capitalist, but being conscious of the consequences of your actions and your choices and your decisions as an individual investor, as a company, and even as a consumer.
Okay. So let's backtrack a little bit.
Okay, let's backtrack. Having had an introduction.
So megatrends, let's just talk about the word megatrends and where it comes from.
Great.
It has a long history.
Yes, indeed.
So let's trace that word.
Well, what is a megatrend, in other words? A megatrend is a large, overarching direction in which society is moving. It could be an economic megatrend, it could be a political megatrend, it could be a social megatrend. And it's called a megatrend because it isn't just a trend, it certainly isn't a fad. Maybe a fad would be the lower level, it certainly isn't a fad. A trend would be a certain direction, but a megatrend means like a large general direction in which society is headed. As a general proposition, a megatrend is something that emerges from the grassroots up. It's a bottom-up trend, a bottom-up happening. And the book the name goes back to a book that was published in 1982 called Megatrends by John Nesbitt. And I was his collaborator on that book. And it was, a publishing phenomenon. It was very, very successful. It was a #1 bestseller for a very, very long time in the United States. And it topped the bestseller lists in Germany and in Japan. And in megatrends, one of the fundamental megatrends that we talked about was the shift from an industrial society to an information society.
Right.
And when that happens, what does it mean for us? What does it mean? So I guess another aspect of a megatrend, there's the trend itself, and it's a big trend, and it's a general trend, and oftentimes it's a subtle trend.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to help people understand it when they're still sort of floundering around to define it.
Yes, and when the trend is still relatively new.
Yeah.
For example, in getting back to this information to an industrial shift, that book was published in 1982, and at that point, it was very controversial for us to say that our economy is moving from an industrial economy to an information society or economy, because many people said information.
How can you make money?
How can you make money on information?
Right.
Impossible. And yet, the way you really define what the society is about is how do the people in the society earn their money?
Okay.
And by the early 1980s, more and more people were earning their income processing information.
So now we're at the other end of that trend, and now we sit there and look at people that are fighting for their manufacturing jobs going, manufacturing isn't in the United States anymore. You can't afford to manufacture in the United States anymore. So that's the whole, the information has taken over, and then, so what comes next? Because we know we don't stay still, and that's the whole point of a whole,
I'm
of
so
the
glad you
Megatrends
asked
books.
that question. I'm so glad you asked that question, because the information society, the information economy is already over. And in its place is an exciting and dynamic new era, and I'd like to tell you about it. It is often said that in a technology-driven era, you have to have, if you're a business, continuous innovation. If you're a high-tech firm, you can't just sit around and wait for your customers to tell you what they want. You've got to drive the market by anticipating what people need. And in order to do that, you have to innovate, 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 innovate continuously. There's a fantastic company called Medtronic, which is a medical device company. And for every product they have in the market, they are working on 4 generations of upgrades.
Wow.
That's continuous innovation, and that company has been enormously successful for a decade or longer. Their profits grew at 20% a year, which is pretty outstanding.
Mm-hmm. So you can't be afraid that the direction that you're trying to innovate is just going to be some dead-end road.
Well, sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. But you've got to innovate anyway if you want to keep ahead of the game. And so how do you innovate? The only way that a company can continue to innovate and really set the pace in a fast-paced technological economy is through the ingenuity of human consciousness. That engineer who's sitting there working on a problem is the key to all of the success of the future in a technology-driven continuous innovation economy. And what does that person need to be able to do? They need to be able to be aware, to be quiet, to be contemplative. In short, they need to draw on the resource of human consciousness. We have shifted from the information era to the new economy of consciousness, in which the wealth that gets produced is produced out of the realm of consciousness. And I'm going to give you a fantastic, homey, nitty-gritty example.
Yeah.
I could talk about Apple and the iPod and how for years everybody said, forget it, Apple is never going to succeed. They don't have the market share. But I would read those reports and say, but they have the creativity, but they have the innovation. I wish I had been, had published my book, 5 years ago, in which I would have said, Mark, Apple is going to succeed because it honors creativity and innovation to such an extent. And now we all know that not just the success of the iPod, but that the iPod is attracting Windows and Microsoft people into Apple hardware. Quarter by quarter, it's winning over more and more converts. But that's not the example I'm going to give you, because I want it to be homey and easy. So here's the example I'm going to give you. That wealth comes from consciousness. I happen to know you're a great Harry Potter fan.
I just finished the newest Harry Potter.
You're kidding! Already?
I read it this weekend.
You read it this weekend?
I did. That's about all I did this weekend.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Well, I happen to be a great Harry Potter fan, too. So it just tickles me when I hear that up until, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the richest woman in the UK was, the Queen of England.
Right.
And to hear now that this welfare mother who sat and scribbled in cafes, as I did myself many, many times for many years, through her ingenuity, through her creativity, through the realm of consciousness that she entered into in her creative states, has become the wealthiest woman in England. That's what I mean about the new economy of consciousness driving wealth in our future. And it's starting right now.
And the, the information highway I mean, the technology is helping us do that because you can talk to people anywhere in the world. You can sell something on eBay and you can ship it off to India. I mean, I have a friend that was trying to get her her computer to work. And so she's on the phone and she's talking to India,
Right.
and then she's talking to Texas, and then
Right.
she's, I mean, she's talking all over the world for somebody to help her figure out how to turn her virus software off so she can put a new product on. So that is helping. We couldn't have gotten there to sort of the individual can create and put it out there in the world until we had gone through the information technology.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And technology is accelerating all the connection points. But consciousness is primary over technology because technology cannot create the human capacity for silence, for the awareness of awareness, for the high states of creativity that a J.K. Rowling or that an engineer at Apple or anyone else can enter into. I'm going to give you a little Patricia Aberdeen maxim here. Technology is consciousness externalized. Remember those cartoons? I know, that's really hard to get. Okay. I'm going to make it homey. I'm going to make it homey again. Remember those cartoons where you have the caveman?
Mm-hmm.
The invention of the wheel?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Cartoons? What do they show?
They show the people.
They show the caveman standing there with a bubble over his head and seeing in his mind's eye the wheel.
Right.
That is what I mean by technology is consciousness externalized. It has to happen up here first. Gotta happen up here.
So people are in their jobs, just doing their job. They go to work every day. They commute in the car for God knows how long around here these days. And they arrive at work. How do they bring consciousness into their own space that they already have? You've got whatever managers are over you sort of saying whatever they want to say, and whether that it's, is your tiny voice heard? Just all the dilemmas that, you're sort of stuck there
Right.
in your space. Not everybody works in a perfect working atmosphere. Nobody works in a perfect working atmosphere.
Well, those of us who work alone at least come. No, it's far from perfect working alone.
Yes, not something I do well.
Well, you raise a very interesting point, and I'm going to back up a little bit to answer that question, and return again to the subtitle of my book, Megatrends 2010: The Rise of Conscious Capitalism. What is conscious capitalism? It's a bunch of different trends, a bunch of different forces or trends converging to change the shape of business. And one of those trends is the search for meaning and morals in business. At the bottom-up level, the manager that you're talking about, who's just kind of, going to work in the morning, wanting their work to make a difference, is frustrated by the way that we've moved away from ethics in business. And there is, more than ever before, a desire for meaning and morals in business that might be illustrated in the grassroots trend towards spirituality in business. That's one of them. Mm-hmm. Employees, I'm going to give you an example of spirituality in business. Picture yourself in San Francisco. It's Thursday, the second Thursday of the month, and you're in the middle of the financial district. In an organization that is synonymous with American capitalism, at 12 noon, there are, say, 14 people sitting around a conference table. And one of the leaders of the group lights a candle, and the people bow their heads in silence and breathe and are very quiet together. And after a while, just after being quiet and silent, one of the organizers opens the floor and invites anyone to speak. And people share their concerns about work. They share the meeting that at one of the meetings, this CPA, an Asian man in his 50s, said, "How do you deal with an organization that is only focused on the numbers?" And one by one, people kind of share where they are. This is the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce Brown Bag Lunch.
Wow.
And it happens the second Thursday of every month, where people come together to talk about where their personal spirituality meets their business life. And it's an hour, and it's completely unstructured. It's not like, oh, we're going to have a speaker and they're going to talk about blah, blah, blah. Just people say, well, where you are? What's up for you? What's going on for you? And it works out amazingly well, because it seems as if a topic just seems to emerge from the people sharing, and someone in the group seems to always have the resources to talk about it. So this is one example of the quest for meanings and morals in business. At the more top-down level, at the more corporate level, there's a fascinating interest in new solutions to typical business problems that bring in the dimension of consciousness, the dimension of spirituality. More and more companies, from Yahoo to Google to Apple to McKinsey to AstraZeneca, have company-sponsored meditation programs. Well, of course, some of it is for stress management, but it isn't lost on these people that meditation is the gateway to corporate creativity and innovation. So more and more companies, hundreds, probably thousands of companies, are sponsoring meditation courses and yoga courses. There's a great example at American Express, and this is about, there's this psychologist named Fred Luskin who wrote this book called Learning to Forgive. And he is very, very involved in something called the Forgiveness Project. He's done work all over the world, in Northern Ireland, in all kinds of conflict places where forgiveness has been essential for the healing of communities. So he said, well, how would forgiveness training work in a corporation? How would it help productivity? So American Express invited him in. And he got, 13 or 14 volunteers to go through this program with him. They read his book. They read an article by Stephen Covey, the 7 Habits guy. And so they tracked the results. They had these metrics. One of them was about stress. One of them was about positive feelings. And one of them was just like an American Express, like productivity, sales productivity figure. These were like stockbrokers. After a year program, the stress levels had gone down 25% among this control group.
Yeah.
The positive feelings level had increased 20%, but their sales productivity had increased 18% compared to themselves. That was pretty good. But what was interesting was that their productivity was 60% higher than that of their peers. Fine, very good results. But that wasn't the end of it. They repeated it 3 more times with 3 more different groups. And the results got better and better and better until at the end of this study, when they had put 4 groups of people through, they had the final results of the study was that the forgiveness-trained stockbrokers outperformed their peers by 60 to 400%.
Wow.
So it's really interesting.
So what are they changing?
What are they changing?
What are they changing? What are the stockbrokers doing differently?
They're becoming more and more at peace with themselves. And being at peace with yourself, it's the thing that's at the crux of this is, how does becoming a better person or becoming a more peaceful person through meditation or through forgiveness training or through another fascinating one called heart math. How do these tools or conscious techniques, you might call them, there are a whole bunch of different ones, that people pursue in their private life for their quote-unquote spiritual growth, how can some of these solutions work for companies? And the answer is they can work. Being a person who's grounded in their well-being, being a person who's at peace with themselves, rather than all of this mythology of the stress and the grind as being more productive. Other studies show that the centered, grounded person who's in their well-being, who's calm, who's relaxed, is the much more productive person. And so slowly studies are starting to prove this. It's at the we're at the very, very beginning stages of this. But I have many, many examples of this in that chapter.
My nephew works for Intel.
One of my favorite companies.
And he had graduated from Clarkson as a computer engineer and spent a year sitting at home getting a job. And you ask him, well, how's it going? He's like, oh, yeah, and you didn't know whether he was really looking for a job. Like he seemed to not be working at it, which is sort of, my nephew is a very internal, very non-social kind of guy. He's very much a computer geek.
Right.
And, and Intel just called him up. They were looking to start a whole new group. And he moved from Albany to New York, out to Oregon. He absolutely loves it. And his little group, which when he joined was 11 people. And he's not social. He not terribly outgoing. He's learned, but it's not sort of natural to his nature. Speaks with he's got a fairly strong speech impediment. Well, he'd worked there for a month, and they started, he was doing the cold calling because they were growing their group. So he was doing the initial interview cold calls to find people suitable for their group. And, it was like, he's doing this already. He was taken into the group and they sent him off to train on some of the equipment he had to use. He helps to break the chips when they first come back.
What do you mean break the chips?
When they build the prototype chips, they come back into the plant and then they try to find ways to break them. What doesn't work about this chip? What, can we do he helps to do all that testing to see what will fail. How can they make the chip fail? And just to make sure that it will go through all the paces. And on Wednesday afternoons, on Wednesdays they all go into work early. He's on flex time. He can get in anywhere from 7 to 9. On Wednesdays, their whole group goes in early, and at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they leave and they go hike together.
Wow.
Anybody that wants to go, this is where they're going to go this week, and they just go somewhere. And they've got gorgeous hiking within an hour drive of where they are, or go out to the ocean, or go out to Mount St. Helens, is 45 minutes away. The Pacific Ocean's 45 minutes away. It's like, so he's really happy. He really loves working for them.
So your nephew, who spent time looking for a job, calmly, in a detached way, with self-possessed and calmly, attracted to him arguably one of the finest corporations on the planet, Intel Corporation, which tops all of the corporate social responsibility lists. And in fact, he got a job there, and they're trusting in him, and he's obviously thriving.
Absolutely.
And doing a fantastic job.
Yep.
That is so great. I talked to the director of social responsibility at Intel because in my research I found something really wonderful they did. A lot of the stuff about social responsibility is about, this project in the inner city or this project in the third world, and those are all fantastic. But what really caught my eye about something that Intel does,
First of all, that they have a director of social
that's
responsibility.
already good. That's already good. Oh, they are, they're exemplary. But in a very, the particular example about Intel, it sounds very mundane, which is that when it comes to accident prevention, they lead the pack. Their accident rate is minuscule compared to their peers. I didn't jot down the figures, but it's under 1% compared to, say, 6 or 7% for the industry as a whole. And they have a rule. This is a great example of how you might have a goal, but how do your policies translate that goal into day-to-day business? And their rule at Intel is that if there is an accident anywhere, and Intel employs over 80,000 people, anywhere in the world, the CEO has to get a report on that within 24 hours. And the analysts at Intel study that accident and work very, very hard to figure out how to prevent it. And recently, in May, there was a changing of the guard at Intel. The long-standing CEO, Craig Barrett, was replaced by a gentleman named Paul Ottolini, or Ottolini, perhaps it's pronounced. And this guy, this director of social responsibility, told me that a memo went out within 24 hours of the changing of the guard at Intel, saying all the accident, and they're amazingly informal. And the memo said, all the accident reports will now go to Paul instead of Craig. And I was like so impressed that didn't take a year. It was like, you know, this is such an important priority at Intel, such a powerful example of corporate responsibility, that they care enough that they don't want to have these accidents, and they don't want their people to be injured. And it's great that I'm sure they have great profit sharing and health benefits and all that, but you know, hey, keeping people
Taking
safe
care of
is
them
important
on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah. So let's go back. Let's talk a little bit more about your book and sort of how it's built. I mean, how do you sit down and you've got 7 chapters.
I do.
You do. I know.
I had 8. I had 8.
Uh-oh.
But I decided that chapter 8 was really the conclusion of the book. And I thought that 7 was a kind of nice round number.
Right.
So I changed chapter 8 into the conclusion and kept the other 7 chapters.
So we've talked a fair bit about the business part and some of the other things. So what's the values-driven consumer is one of the names of one of your chapters.
That's a good one.
What's that all about?
That's a good one. Well, I'll tell you what it's all about. And later, let's try to get to chapter 1, because that's called The Power of Spirituality.
Yeah.
From the individual. That chapter 1 has kind of a little subtitle, which is kind of from the individual to the organization, how spirituality is changing. But you asked about the conscious consumer and values-driven consumer.
Values-driven, yeah.
And I will be glad to tell you what that is all about. 63 million Americans can be categorized as values-driven consumers. What does that mean? It means that, well, let me step back a minute. There's a fellow named Paul Ray who wrote a fantastic book called The Cultural Creatives, and his area is market research. And for over a decade, he studied how consumers make decisions about things. Is it from income? Is it from demographics? Is it from psychographics? And he concluded that the most important factor in how consumers make decisions is their values and their lifestyle. So, if values determine or even strongly influence your choices as a consumer, you are a values-driven consumer. Now,
so what kind of values?
Well, that depends. Of course, I'll give you some great. I decided to talk about 3 areas to illustrate the notion of the values-driven consumer, because the answer to that is it varies on what sector we're talking about.
Okay.
But the three sectors that I studied for the values-driven consumer, before I go into those, I'm wondering if I should say a little bit more about it. Well, yeah, I should. I want to make the point that there are studies that ask consumers, you know, does it matter to you if a corporation has a good reputation for as a corporate citizen?
Mm-hmm.
And 90% of people say that, of consumers say that are studied in these polls, and
Right.
the one I'm thinking of is put out by the Cone organization. 90% of people say that they consider a company's behavior when they decide on a product. If a product or a company were considered irresponsible, socially irresponsible, it would influence them. Now, 36% say that would be very, very, very important to them. And so I'm going to say, this is a kind of a complicated formula, that something around 25 to 36% of consumers are what we might call values-driven consumers. Okay. So having said that, back to your question, what kind of values? Well, it depends on the segment that you're dealing with. Three areas that I took a look at were hybrid cars, natural or organic groceries, and green building. And so values-driven consumers are setting the pace in these three fascinating areas. Hybrid cars. I mean, sure, people care about them because they're saving money on gas, but really these are people who are buying hybrid cars are people who care about the environment, obviously.
Right. They're investing in more than just saving gas.
Yes,
Yeah.
and they care about pollution, and they care about depleting natural resources. So that's one example, and of course the whole story about hybrid cars is an extraordinary one. I heard a report the other day that the Toyota Prius is the fastest since October of 2002, and I've got to track down this report. This is the problem when you write books like this and you see, oh, what happened to that story that was on TV? But it is the fastest selling car. Now, what does that mean? Is it the best-selling car? Actually, the Toyota Camry is the best-selling car. But the fastest-selling car means how many days does it take till it disappears off the showroom floor?
Okay. Yeah.
And that has been the fastest-selling car. So, very, very important. And it's important also in that conscious consumers are transforming capitalism. Conscious consumers are transforming capitalism because by voting with their values, they are making a dent in free enterprise. Many car companies said, oh, no hybrids, you know, we're not going to mess around with that. We don't care about that.
Right, right.
GM said, we're not going to make hybrids. Nissan said, we're not going to make hybrids. Conscious consumers changed their policies because they adopted hybrid cars with such enthusiasm that these companies literally couldn't not do it anymore. They just couldn't do it. And of course there's the whole debate about hydrogen cars, and certainly hydrogen cars sound fantastic. The problem is it's going to be 1 to 2 decades before we get them, and it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars in investment to have the fuel stations. So, hybrid cars are pretty important. And values-driven consumers and their passion for green automotive technology are totally driving the market. Values. Not cost, but values.
Oh, okay. So that's the distinction, is it's not a purely cost-based decision.
Absolutely not. In fact, values-driven consumers will cheerfully pay more to get what they want. Their values are what's determining their purchases. Of course, if it's ridiculously expensive, chances are they might not follow the conscious consumption trend. But in these three areas, they are. organic food is
Organic food.
more expensive than other food.
Right.
But we, of course, have the other local example of Whole Foods, the old, you know, having bought out Bread and Circus here in the Boston area. The grocery sector is flat. It's as flat as GM car sales.
But even my local grocery store down the street
Now
has
organic
to have
food.
organic. They have to have organic eggs. They have
Right.
to have organic milk.
Right.
And